In this video, we'll be taking a look at how to create a EC2 instance using the AWS CLI. And if you go to this link right here, so aws.amazon.com/CLI, in the top right corner, we have the installations right here. I'm not going to go ahead and I'm not going to go through the installation because we're big boys and I think we can figure it out. The only thing you might run into is when I installed it, it automatically added it to my path environment variable. But if you try and use the same shell after the installation, you might run into issues. So you might need to create a new shell. Anyways. So the first thing you're going to want to do when you get the AWS CLI is you're going to want to configure it. And when you go and configure it, you're going to run the following command. And so the first value is your AWS access key ID. And you can get that when you sign up with AWS, and you're going to want to keep that secret because if someone gets a hold of this and the AWS secret access key, well then they can basically use your account to spin up a whole bunch of GPUs and run your bill up thousands of dollars while they're mining Bitcoin or something like that. And so keep that stuff secret. Don't let anyone get their hands on it. And then the next parameter is the default region you're going to use. So without having to specify the region in your commands, it will use this region by default. And here we're using US East 1. If you don't know which one to use, I'll tell you about that later. And then finally, the last one is the output format. And so you have three formats to choose from. You have plain text, you have JSON, and you have table. By default, it's JSON, which is what we'll be using. And so that's that. Now I will clear that because I don't want you guys to hack me. And now, so if you do not know the name of the region, you can go ahead and run AWS EC2 describe regions, and then we can output in the table format because it'll be a bit cleaner than JSON. And as you can see here, we have the different region names. And I know I didn't really dive into it in this video. If you're not too familiar with cloud computing, then watch the Azure video I made. But essentially, in these different locations in the world, Amazon has data centers, and these data centers have the hardware that we'll be using. If you're in Canada or US, you're pretty safe going with US East, I would say. I think it's the largest one. They have the most resources. Anyways, so before we can create our EC2 instance, we're going to have to define a security group. And you can think of a security group as basically a virtual firewall. So it will specify who's allowed to connect to your instance. And so to create one, we do AWS EC2 create security group, and then we need to give it a name. Here we're going to give it the name of example, and then a short description. This is an example. Now you're going to want to keep track of this group ID because we're going to use it later. And so you can just open up a notepad and paste it in there. So now what we're going to do is we're going to specify the rules of this security group. And to do that, we do AWS EC2 authorize security group ingress. And then we need the matching group name, which is example. The protocol we're going to use is going to be TCP. We need to open up port 22 because we're going to connect to our EC2 instance using PuTTY, and that's the port used by SSH. And lastly, we're going to specify the CIDR. Basically what this does is it specifies the range of IP addresses that are allowed to try to connect to your computer on the open ports, in this case port 22. If you put all zeros, then that means all the computers on the internet theoretically could, if they got your public IP address and they got your SSH key, then they could get onto your machine. So if this were not an example, you might want to change this such that only you can connect to it, but we'll leave it as anyone for now because it's simpler. All right, now what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to create the key pair that we'll be using. When I was doing this earlier, on Windows, you're going to run into an issue where the PuTTY won't take in the key. And so what you have to do is you have to make sure you use a command prompt and not a PowerShell. I think it might be related to how PowerShell replaces single quotes with double quotes. And so what we want to do is EC2 create key pair, and then the key name will pass it test key. Now here's where it's going to get you. For the query, you have to make sure you use double quotes and a command prompt on Windows. If you're on Mac or Linux, then keep it as single quotes, it doesn't really matter. But if you're on Windows, like me, you have to make sure you do that. And then we basically what this is going to return is it's going to return our private key, and we're piping it to a .pem file. And it didn't like that. Why didn't it like that? Key name, test key, query, key material, output, text. Ah, I forgot the T. It already exists. So in the previous recording, I forgot to delete it, so we'll just switch that to example. Essentially, you want to name it because the command line interface will keep track of your public keys, and we could list that, but we won't do it because I don't really know the command off the top of my head. And so now if we do an ls, we have our example-key.pm file. And if you're on Windows, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to open up PuTTY, and we're going to load this file. So you're going to have to go to all files, and then we're going to select example-key.pm, and then we're going to want to save the key. We won't put a passphrase, and we're going to save it as example-key.ppk. And we need to do this because PuTTY by default can't handle .pem files. And so now we will talk about Amazon machine images. So I shall basically, if you want to launch image, you can select from various Amazon Machine Images, or AMIs. You can think of Amazon Machine Images as the OS that will run on your EC2 instance. Since we're using the command line interface, if you go to this URL right here, they have a finding quick start for AMI. And what we can do here is we can get the latest version of the AMI that we're going to be using, and we're going to be using the Amazon Linux 2 AMI, which is free tier eligible. Now, on Windows, because you don't have the JQ command, you're just going to want to copy this part, and we'll run that, and then the rest is essentially, it's just taking the last value in the array because it's the most recent. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the image ID here because we're going to need it when we go to create our instance. Now we need to, we'll take a look at the instance types. So let's say we pick this one. The next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to select the instance type. And what the instance type does is it specifies the underlying hardware, right? So if you have just because you have the latest version of Windows on your computer doesn't mean it's going to be fast, right? If your computer is a decade old, you're going to be complaining about how slow it is. Well, the operating system and the hardware that runs it are completely independent. And so the instance type will specify things like the number of cores or the amount of RAM you have, how fast its network performance is, and what kind of storage you can have. And as you can see, there's really only one option here, which is the T2 micro, which is what we're going to be using. And so I think we have everything we need. So what we're going to do is we're going to do AWS EC2 run instances. What I don't like about the AWS CLI is sometimes these commands will have an S and sometimes they won't. It always trips me up because you won't be able to, right? Like here before, I swear they always have an S, but here it's singular. So we're going to go ahead and pass the ID for our AMI image. And then we're going to pass the security group ID. See, here it has an S. And we're going to pass it that. Now we are going to give it the instance type, and we're using t2.micro. And finally, the key name, which in our example is example-key. Alright, and you can see right here the state is pending, so it's currently creating our VM. If we went back here, we could see it pending right there, but we could also do it from the command line interface. Describe images? No, instances, I think. Yeah, there you go. All right, so there's multiple right now just because I had previous recordings. Sorry about that. But you can probably see right here. All right, so now the state is running. And so what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to take the instance ID because we're going to need that later. And we're also going to want to take the public IP address because we're going to need that as well. All right, so now what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to connect to our instance, and we do that using PuTTY. And so what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to open up SSH, go to auth, and then we're going to select our PPK file. right here. Going back to session, the way you connect to it is you use the default username and then the @ and then the IP address for all Linux Amazon images. So if I go back to here, all the ones that are like this, the default username is going to be EC2-user. And so we're going to take the public IP address that we had, put it in there, open, yes, we trust this. And now if I did a pwd, if I went to the root directory, did an ls, you can see that we are on our EC2 instance in the cloud. So you can play around with this. Once you're done, you want to hit exit. And then we want to clean up because we don't want Amazon to charge us. So before you can terminate an instance, you're going to have to stop it. And so we're going to do AWS EC2 stop instances, instance IDs, and then we're going to pass it the ID that we stored right over here. It doesn't seem right. Let's try that again. Alright. That might take a little while to stop. We can take a look at it in here if we want. EC2. Running instances. Currently stopping. We can refresh it from here. We can take a look at it from here. And it is still in a stopping state. I may or may not cut the video, depending on how long it takes. Yeah, we're gonna cut this for sure. Alright, we're back. It stopped. So now what we can do is we can delete it. And the way we delete it is we run AWS EC2 terminate instances, and you do instance IDs. Make sure we do the double dash there, and we pass it our instance ID. And again, this is probably going to involve more waiting. So I'm going to take another pause and I will come back when it already terminated. I guess it terminates really quickly. Never mind then. Well, that's how you set up and delete a instance, EC2 instance on AWS. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. Ciao.